The stories you're about to hear are based on true events shared by real people. I was 11 years old. At the time, I was living in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of a small town in Vermont. There was a lot of road work and development happening nearby. The workers often tapped into the power lines, causing frequent outages and flickers. As a result, the streetlights rarely worked, especially in winter, when the sun disappeared early and the darkness settled in thick. That's relevant, so keep it in mind. From what I remember, it was a weekend I was supposed to spend at my friend's house. For 11-year-old me, this was an exciting prospect, especially after a long week loaded with schoolwork. I was to spend Friday night sleeping over and spend all of Saturday at her countryside home, returning home that evening. What made it even better was that her parents had an unavoidable event to attend, so they trusted us to stay alone in their 2-story house for the 6 hours they would be gone. Back then, the idea of spending a whole night alone with my friends sounded great. No interference, and 6 whole hours of games and movies on their huge TV. As it turns out, my friend Mira had other ideas. I arrived at her house just before 8 p.m. It was already pretty dark out, and her parents waited for me to arrive before going over emergency contacts, dinner details, and reminders. They also told us to bring in their 4-year-old golden retriever, as the weather was acting up and his kennel had a few loose panels that leaked when it rained. This is another important detail to note. After they left, we watched a few cartoons, had dinner, and were chilling in her living room playing cards. That's when Mira had the genius idea to explore a fenced plot of land a few hundred meters down the street. There was no active construction there, so most of the area was either covered in debris or overgrown with plants and weeds. We brought the dog inside, leashed him to a long chain that allowed him to roam within limits, grabbed the keys and left the house for the short 10-minute walk. At this point, it was around 10 p.m. In hindsight, this was the moment we still had a chance to avoid what happened next. But being the curious and daring 11-year-olds we were, we ventured out anyway. We arrived without much trouble and started climbing the 2-meter wall surrounding the lot. Luckily, parts of the wall were broken, giving us enough grip to climb over. Once inside, Mira suggested we sit a few meters apart for as long as we could, until one of us got too scared. We faced each other and walked backward until we could barely see each other's silhouettes in the dim light. After what felt like 10 minutes, I saw Mira's hunched form suddenly rise and start walking toward me, fast and erratically, jumping over rocks and getting scratched by thorns. Just as I was about to laugh and tease her for getting scared, she said, "We need to go feed Toby." I remember being confused. Her parents had already filled the dog's bowl with food, and he had a water dispenser. But her face, I've never seen her look so pale. She looked like she had seen a ghost. Without asking questions, I agreed. We scrambled back over the wall quickly and in silence. The moment my feet hit the ground, Mira grabbed my arm and just started sprinting. She gripped me so tightly I had a bruise for 2 weeks. We ran like hell was chasing us, through the metal gate of her front yard. She told me to unlock the front door while she deadbolted the big metal gate behind us, locking it to the ground in between the 2 panels. By now, I was starting to panic. Once inside, Mira ran through the house, locking every door and window and pulling the curtains shut. I was confused, and so was her dog, who followed her around anxiously. After about 10 minutes, she returned to the living room, face still pale, and explained everything. While we were sitting apart in the lot, she had looked slightly to my right and seen another human silhouette crouched in the bushes. At first, she thought she was imagining it until it moved. It crept closer to where I was sitting, seemingly unaware she was watching. She didn't want to startle me or the person, so she made up the excuse about feeding the dog to get us out. After hearing that, I was shaken. We hugged for a few minutes and decided not to tell our parents. We'd been warned not to leave the compound. We didn't want to ruin the sleepover, so we peeked out the window. The street looked empty, and we eventually tried to put it behind us. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but what happened next has stuck with me ever since. Let me describe her property. Her house was surrounded by lawn on 2 sides, which was in turn enclosed by a 2.5-meter wall. The wall had a single entrance, those tall metal gates I mentioned earlier. The house had windows all around and 2 entrances. The front door and a door connected to a small attached space made of reinforced metal mesh, like a heavy-duty cage. That space had a metal door with a lock only accessible from the inside, and an inner door made of lightweight wood with only a deadbolt. That's important. About an hour after the incident, we were upstairs in her air-conditioned room playing games when we heard the dog barking downstairs. But not just barking, growling. That was unusual for him. Mira went down to get him and came back saying he was growling at the front door and didn't want to leave it. It took real effort to bring him upstairs. We thought maybe a stray had passed by, so we stepped out onto the balcony attached to her room. It overlooked the front lawn and part of the street, but what we saw wasn't a stray, it was a person. Standing in the lawn directly in front of the door. Even in the dim light, we could make out layers of dirty, muddy clothing and long, matted hair. The dog whimpered beside us, wanting to go out. We crouched in the balcony, whispering about what to do, when we heard the front door handle rattling. Then a window next to the door shook. He was trying to find a way in. We crept downstairs. He was now at another window, circling the house. That's when Mira froze and whispered. She forgot to lock the metal door to the attached space. We both went pale. That outer door led directly to the wooden door inside, the one with only a bolt. We heard rattling from the back of the house. He was almost back to the front again. That meant we had a few seconds before he reached the attached space. Mira told me to wait by the inner door with the dog. She was going to quietly bolt the outer metal door. If she got caught, she told me to let the dog out and lock the inner door behind him to avoid being found. Terrified, I stood there while she sneaked out. She fumbled with the lock and ran back inside, just as we heard violent rattling at the outer door. If she hadn't gone when she did, he might have gotten inside. We backed away and stayed frozen for a while, listening. After a few minutes of silence, we crept back upstairs and went out onto the balcony again. He was still there, in the front lawn. This time his head was tilted back. It felt like he was staring straight at us. But we had killed the lights, drawn the curtains, and turned off everything but a tiny bedside lamp. He couldn't have seen us. Then he started giggling. In the dead of night, he dropped to all fours and began crawling around the lawn, laughing louder. We should have called the police, but we were 11, scared, dumb, and worried we'd get in trouble for sneaking out. He kept at it for nearly half an hour before standing up, walking to the corner, climbing onto the kennel, and jumping over the wall. We waited in silence. An hour passed. No sign of him. Around 2 a.m., her parents finally returned. The next morning, they were confused. Why were all the doors and windows locked on such a pleasant night? Why was there mud on the front doorknob? We just said we were playing in the dark. To this day, I don't think that man was ever caught. For anyone wondering how he got into the lawn, the next morning we checked and found boxes stacked near the side wall. He must have climbed up using those. We also went back to the abandoned lot in broad daylight while the road was busy, but didn't see anyone around. This story happened about a year ago. I was living with my then boyfriend. I'll just call him Jay. He's my fiance now. We were renting a small townhouse in a quiet suburban area. It felt pretty safe. There had been a couple of break-ins a few blocks over, but nothing that made me feel like I couldn't walk home alone at night. One weekend, Jay's brother Zach, his girlfriend Lena, and Lena's brother Chris came to visit. The plan was to chill, have a few drinks, play video games, and relax. Jay had his LSATs coming up, and after months of intense studying, he just wanted a stress-free weekend. Unfortunately, I got hit with the worst flu I've ever had. Insanely high fever, a degree higher, and I would have needed the hospital. Nausea, pounding headache, body aches, the whole deal. I didn't want to ruin their plans, so they came over anyway, and I stayed in bed. They had eaten before coming over, so I was home alone watching TV in bed, feeling like death. I was dozing off and on. Around 4 p.m., I heard the front door open and figured they were back. But when I called out for Jay, no one answered. Even if he had come in, he might not have heard me. I figured it was nothing, maybe the neighbors or something falling, and went back to sleep. At some point, I remember waking up groggy, still on my back, and I thought I saw a figure move across my room. But I was so out of it, heavily medicated high fever. I didn't fully process what I saw. It didn't click that it could have been someone. The room was dark, and I think I just convinced myself it was something on the TV. Around 7 p.m., everyone came back. They were loud, laughing, especially Lena, who was tipsy and always extra fun when she's drinking. Jay came in to check on me and brought me some soup. He sat and chatted with me while I ate. At some point, I asked him to grab the new bottle of aspirin from the basket under the bed. We had a full-size bed with a small basket underneath where I kept random things: pill bottles, toothbrushes, extra stuff. What I didn't know at that moment was that thank God he actually looked under the bed. He handed me the aspirin, but his face had completely changed, like all the color had drained from it. I thanked him, but he said, "Come on, I'm gonna take you to the B bathroom." He never stutters. Even through my fever haze, I caught that something was wrong. I told him I didn't need to go and didn't feel like moving. He insisted, "No, let's go. I don't want to have to come all the way back up here in 10 minutes if you change your mind." I remember feeling a little hurt by how he said it, but I just had soup and water, so he wasn't wrong. He helped me downstairs, and I was too drained to argue or even question why we didn't just use the upstairs bathroom. He sat me down on the couch. "What's going on?" I asked, barely whispering. Apparently it came out louder than I thought. He pulled out his phone and his hands were shaking. I asked again what was wrong, and I will never forget the look on his face when he whispered, "There was someone under the bed." Lena laughed at first, so I laughed too, thinking maybe it was some kind of prank, but it felt serious. Zach told us we needed to get out of the house, so we did. As we were heading out, we heard a thud from upstairs. We bolted and didn't look back. Once we got in the car, we called the police. The police showed up and searched the house but didn't find anyone. Whoever it was must have known we suspected something and slipped out. Josh didn't get a good look. All he saw were a pair of sneakers. It was too dark to see anything clearly. The most chilling part? The police found a knife under the bed. A small, rusty steak knife. Dull, but still, it was a weapon. There hadn't been any attacks reported nearby, so our friends assumed maybe the guy was just looking for a place to crash. But I don't know. I have theories, but no real answers. I'm still not sure how he even got in. What I do know is I'm proud of how Jay handled the whole thing. He stayed calm in a terrifying situation. I always thought he might freeze in a crisis, but he didn't. And I hope I never ever see whoever was under that bed again. I've always been good friends with one of my cousins, Dylan, who's the same age I am. The two of us were not quite inseparable, but we always got along really well and were often found together. Both in school, we somehow ended up in the same class every year throughout elementary, and outside of it. When we were 12 and in the 6th grade, I was hanging out with Dylan on a Friday afternoon in late May, and we were psyched that the weekend was starting. We ended up at his house, which wasn't far from mine, and at one point my mom called to say that our grandma was in the hospital. It wasn't life-threatening, but she was being kept overnight for observation. Both my parents and Dylan's were planning to stay with her and our grandfather at the hospital, since my mom and her sister were the only siblings who lived nearby. I was told it was okay for me to spend the night at Dylan's, with his 15-year-old brother Liam being in charge while the adults were out. This was totally fine by us. I got along well with Liam. He wasn't one of those bossy older brothers you hear horror stories about. We ordered pizza and spent the evening goofing off like kids that age tend to do. Around 9 p.m., there was a knock at the front door. Dylan went to answer it. I was a little curious who it could be at that time of night, so I watched from a distance. Two older guys were at the door. They said they were from the city and were investigating reports about low water pressure in the neighborhood. They asked if Dylan's parents were home, and Dylan told them they were unavailable, which we were told to say if our parents weren't home. That's when they started asking a lot of questions about how the water pressure was, if we'd noticed anything strange, and if they could come inside to check. Liam came over at that point and politely told them everything was fine and that maybe they should check with other houses. The men seemed reluctant to leave, but they eventually turned and walked off after Liam began closing the door. We looked at each other and shrugged, but didn't think too much about it after that. We went back to hanging out and eventually decided to go to bed. Dylan and Liam shared a bedroom, and we agreed I'd sleep in there with them instead of on the couch so we could keep chatting as we fell asleep. Liam grabbed a sleeping bag from their camping gear for me. Once in the room, they stripped down to their briefs, and I remembered Dylan had told me before that they usually slept that way. I hadn't brought any overnight clothes since I didn't plan on staying, but I wasn't in the mood to sleep fully dressed either, so I stripped to my briefs too. I felt a bit self-conscious at first, but it was just the three of us and I knew they wouldn't care. They climbed into their beds and I slid into the sleeping bag. We talked for a while about random stuff before we all dozed off. Sometime early the next morning, I woke up because I had to pee. I got up quietly, went to the bathroom, and on the way back, I heard something coming from the family room, which was on the opposite end of the house from the bedrooms. At first, I figured maybe it was Dylan or Liam, until I got back to the bedroom and saw both of them still asleep. Trying not to panic, I woke them up and told them I thought someone might be in the house. They quietly followed me, and when we stepped into the family room, we froze. The two guys from the night before were in there, clearly robbing the place. One of them noticed us, and as he stepped toward us, he pulled out a wicked-looking knife. We didn't wait. The three of us bolted for the front door, somehow managed to get it unlocked and open, and sprinted outside. As luck would have it, a cop car happened to be driving by at that exact moment. We flagged him down and told him what was going on. He called for backup, and within minutes, more officers arrived. They went into the house and, after a short search, caught the two men. Turns out they'd broken in through a window in the laundry room that had a broken latch. The cops figured they had targeted the house because it was clear there were no adults home, just a few kids they probably thought would be easy to scare off or overpower. To make matters worse, while we were waiting outside during the search, some neighbors came out to see what the commotion was, including a few kids from our school. A couple were even in our class. That's when we realized we were still standing outside in nothing but our underwear. It felt like one of those stereotypical nightmare scenarios. We stood there like that for what felt like forever until we were finally allowed back in. When we got back to school on Monday, Dylan and I had to deal with a fair amount of snickering, side eyes, and jokes for the rest of the school year.